On Christmas Eve and Christmas Day of 1914, German, British, and French soldiers gathered together to celebrate the long-held tradition of Christmas. They sang songs, played cards together, and put together a football or soccer match between the British and the French troops against the German troops. They ate dinner together and communed through the night. At midnight on Christmas Eve, a Scottish priest stepped in and soldiers on both sides took part in Christmas Mass. But this was during a war that pitted Germany against Britain and France. Stalemates brought about by trench warfare created a static environment where little ground was gained and at terrible losses to both sides. So how did enemies come together during such a destructive war and participate in a truce during the holiday? Many myths have been perpetuated about the Christmas truce of 1914 since it occurred, and most interpret it as a rebellion against the war itself. However, on the eve of the 100-year anniversary of the event, Terry Crocker wrote a book entitled The Christmas Truce: Myth, Memory, and the First World War, where she explains how the event changed over the years from how it actually happened. She argues that the truce was not an act of defiance, but one that arose from the convergence of a number of factors: the professionalism of the soldiers involved, the unprecedented condition of the static trench warfare, the adaptation of the troops to their new environment, foul weather on the Western Front, the absence of major initiatives along that front during the last 2 weeks of December, and memories of traditional celebrations of Christmas. The holiday truce, in short, was caused by rain, mud, curiosity, lack of personal animosity toward the enemy, and homesickness rather than by frustration and rebellion. Welcome to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and today we will talk about the myth and reality of the Christmas truce of 1914. Documentaries and other avenues of media portray it as the lower-ranking soldiers rebelling against the officers who sent them to die in no man's land. They claim the officers reprimanded their troops for intermingling with the enemy, and when the lower ranks refused to fire on the new friends, they were transferred to other sectors of the battle lines. Crocker points out that the lieutenant colonel of the 1st Grenadier Guards wrote to his wife that the Germans say they want the truce to go on till after New Year, and I am sure I have no objection. A rest from bullets will be distinctly a change. No soldiers were ever punished for their behavior. The truce was widespread, but at the same time local. What I mean by that is that the two sides came together on nearly 15 miles of a 20-mile front. However, this was not coordinated. It happened when individual battalions on either side initiated a coming together and celebration of the holiday. 54 British battalions took part in some kind of truce. Some were instigated by caroling taking place on one side or the other, and the enemy joining in, which brought them to declare a truce. In a couple of spots along the line, decorated Christmas trees were placed on the parapets, and this got a ceasefire declared. British soldiers reported seeing small lights along the top of the trenches, which to them brought about a sense of peace and easiness, and this began negotiations for a ceasefire. Some battalions simply declared a ceasefire, but no fraternization occurred. A lieutenant recounted, "I was peeping over the parapet when a German waving his arms, and presently 2 of them got out of their trenches and came toward ours. We were just going to fire on them when we saw they had no rifles, so one of our men went out to meet them." For those who did seek social interaction with the other side, pleasantries were exchanged along with cigarettes, food, drinks, and comments about the war. The British found many Germans speaking English because before the war they had worked in England. Multiple football games were played, and some even took pictures with one another. Some soldiers exchanged buttons from their coats as souvenirs. A British private relayed the story that English troops got out of their trenches and the Germans came out of theirs, and we met halfway and talked and exchanged souvenirs, our own bullets for theirs, and they also gave some of our fellows cigars, of which they said they had plenty, and we gave them tins of bully beef, as they said they had very little. It was not all fun and games. Not all the men along those lines joined in the fraternization in no man's land. Many stayed behind the lines with rifles loaded in case the other decided to abandon the truce. In between eating and drinking, bodies were carried to the halfway point for burial by the other side. Crocker points out that much of the Christmas truce involved the burying of the dead. A fascinating aspect of the truce is brought to light by Crocker when she discusses the British ideas towards the various types of Germans. They differentiated between Saxons, Bavarians, and Prussians. The British, in their letters home and diaries, mostly conclude that if Prussians had been on the opposite side of them in the trenches, then the truce would not have been declared. They believed that the Prussians were the ones most responsible for declaring war, and believed that their expansionist mentality made them untrustworthy in such a ceasefire. However, as one Englishman wrote, a Bavarian would never desecrate Christmas. So with the description of the Christmas truce established, let's go into what Crocker believes is the cause for such a truce. Because remember, she argues that it was not a rebellion against the higher-ranking officials. First, she lists the professionalism of the soldiers. Ceasefires are common in warfare, and both sides were aware of them. Numerous ceasefires were declared within the first months of the war leading up to the holiday season because of the immense casualties. Respect between one another as soldiers in the confines of a war brought them together. Second, there had not been any major initiatives in that area of the conflict. There had developed a lull in the war in that 20-mile front mentioned earlier. Both sides had engaged in tough fighting, but the lack of conflict had put them at ease and made each side more receptive to a social gathering in no man's land to celebrate a mutual holiday. Thirdly, and this goes along with the second reason, there had been some nasty weather which had made life in the trenches even more miserable than already experienced. This means that soldiers would jump at the chance to get out of the damp trenches and stand on somewhat dry ground, if only for a few hours or a portion of a day. Fourth, with a group of men who share similar traditions being so close to one another, something like this was bound to happen. Sometimes not more than 100 yards away from one another. This allowed both sides to communicate or have the opportunity to communicate with one another more frequently. Other wars saw men that only saw the enemy in combat situations. But with trench warfare on such a large scale, the situation allowed for men to come together more frequently. Fifth, although men were fighting one another, animosity was at a low point, and from the diaries and letters we've already established that if there was animosity, it was with the Prussians, not the Saxons or the Bavarians. Again, Crocker makes the argument that it was not out of a rebellion against the idea of war, but simply from the environmental circumstances and the close proximity to the enemy. I think one of the biggest takeaways from this event in world history is the power of traditions. Some traditions span continents and the world, like the holiday of Christmas. Along with environmental factors, it brought two opposing sides together. Soldiers had similar experiences in the wars before this when the two sides remained in close proximity to one another. Thank you all again for watching and supporting the channel. I truly appreciate all the views. Links to the Teespring store, Facebook page, Twitter page, and Patreon pages are in the description below. In the weeks coming until the end of December, I will be covering Christmas and holiday-themed events in world history, like the one you heard today. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.